I have been invisible for most of my working life, and I have found over the years that invisibility is not the disadvantage most people assume it to be. When you are invisible, people say things in front of you they would not say in front of someone they could see. They make decisions in front of you they would not make under observation. They are, in a word, honest, in the way that people are only honest when they believe the room contains nobody who will remember. I have spent 17 years cleaning the offices and corridors of Aldren Capital Management on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago, and in those 17 years, I have been the most informed person in any room I entered because I was also the least noticed. I know which partnerships are in trouble. I know which deals are being discussed before they are announced. I know which executives are kind to their assistants when the assistants make mistakes and which ones are not. I know these things not because I seek them out, but because I move through spaces where information lives and people have decided, long before I arrive with my cart, that I am not a recipient of information. I am furniture. I am infrastructure. I am the reason the glass is clear and the floor is clean and the coffee machine has been restocked. And I am not, in any meaningful sense, a person who will remember what was said in front of me. 17 years in, I still find this more useful than insulting. Invisibility is a form of access. What you do with the access is up to you. If you have ever been the person in the room that nobody looked at, and found that not being looked at taught you to see more clearly than any of the people who were, this channel is for you. Subscribe right now, because every story here is for the people who did their best work unseen and found out one morning that what they had built in the invisible years was exactly what someone desperately needed. My name is Leonard Pruitt. I am 48 years old. I am the lead custodian for floors 38 through 42 at Aldren Capital Management in Chicago, which is a private equity firm that manages approximately $8 billion in assets, and which I mention not because the number impresses me, but because it is relevant to understanding the woman at the center of this story, which is to say, it is relevant to understanding the scale of the resources that had already been deployed before I became involved, and why none of them had worked. I am a single father. My son Marcus is 23 years old. He lives in an apartment in Wicker Park with 2 roommates and works part-time at a plant nursery, and is, by every measure I know how to apply, living a life he chose and enjoys, which is the most important thing a parent can hope for and which required, in Marcus's case, a great deal of patience and a very specific education in how to communicate with a person whose relationship with language is not the same as most people's. Marcus was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when he was 3 years old. The diagnosis arrived after 2 years of knowing something and not having a name for it, which is the experience of most parents of autistic children, that period of accumulating evidence that the world is experiencing your child differently than you are experiencing them, and not having the vocabulary yet to describe the gap. I want to be precise about something regarding the diagnosis, because I think the precision matters, and because I have spent 20 years being imprecise about it in ways that cost me. The diagnosis did not tell me who Marcus was. It told me something about how he was wired, which is a different thing entirely. The wiring is a fact. Who Marcus is, what he values, what brings him delight, what he has to offer the world, what kind of person he is becoming, none of that is in the diagnosis. All of that I had to learn directly from him, through the years of paying attention. And the paying attention, which began before the diagnosis and continued long after it, is the education I am still grateful for and still drawing on every day of my working life. I am a single father because his mother left when he was 4. I say this without bitterness. She loved Marcus. She was not equipped at that point in her life for what loving Marcus required, and the honest thing was to acknowledge this rather than remain and do it badly. I do not hold it against her. I do not hold it against anyone who finds the work of understanding a different kind of mind more than they currently have the capacity for, because I know how hard the work is, and I know that the capacity for it is built slowly and is not evenly distributed, and is not a reflection of the quality of a person's love. The diagnosis was not a surprise by that point. It was a name for something we had been learning to navigate for 2 years already, and the name made certain things easier to discuss, and changed nothing about the actual work of understanding my son, which was the work of learning that the language he spoke was real and complete, and required me to expand my understanding of what language is, rather than to help him conform to my narrower version of it. I want to tell you about the years of raising Marcus, before I tell you about the morning that changed everything at Aldren Capital, because those years are the whole reason the morning happened the way it did. Marcus did not speak in the way most children speak until he was 5. He communicated, but not through the channels that most people in his world were prepared to receive. He communicated through the careful arrangement of objects, through the specific routes he chose when we walked together, through the sounds he made when something was right versus wrong, which were distinct and consistent, and took me about 6 months to map accurately. He communicated through proximity, through the particular way he would position himself relative to me when he was content versus when he was overwhelmed, through the angle of his body when he was processing something difficult versus when he had reached a decision. I learned all of this the way you learn a language, which is through immersion and attention, and the willingness to be wrong and try again. I was wrong often in the early years. I misread him constantly. I responded to the wrong signals. I missed the ones that mattered, and every time I missed one I paid attention to what the missing had cost, which is the most efficient way to learn anything. And gradually over years the picture became clearer and the misreadings became less frequent, and what I ended up with, by the time Marcus was 8 or 9, was a fluency in my son's language that I am still more proud of than anything else I have accomplished in my life. I want to tell you about one specific morning with Marcus that I think about whenever I am in a corridor with a child who is not yet being understood, because it is the morning that changed how I understood my own work and my own skill. Marcus was 7 years old. He had been having a difficult week, the kind of week that happens when the world has been slightly too much, and the accumulation of that has built to a point where the smallest additional input produces a response that looks, to people who do not know him, like a meltdown, but is, to me, the entirely rational response of a person whose capacity for input has been exceeded. He was sitting in the corner of our kitchen with his back to the room, rocking slightly, not making eye contact with anything. I sat down on the floor nearby, not close, just present. I did not speak. I did not try to redirect him or reassure him or produce any input at all. I sat on the kitchen floor and I watched the corner of the room that he was looking at, and I breathed at the pace the room required, and I waited. After about 20 minutes he turned around. He looked at me. He said, "You are still here." I said, "Yes." He said, "You always stay." I said, "I will always stay." He turned back to the corner for a few more minutes, and then he got up and made himself a bowl of cereal and sat at the table and ate it. And the difficult week was not over, but the morning was. And what I had done in those 20 minutes was absolutely nothing except remain in the same room without adding anything to what was already there. It took me 7 years to learn that staying, and not adding anything, is the most valuable thing I know how to do. I have been doing it in corridors ever since. What this fluency gave me, beyond the obvious gift of being able to actually communicate with my son, was something I did not anticipate and did not fully understand until I was several years into the work at Aldren. It gave me an ability to read nonverbal communication in any person with an accuracy that most people do not develop, because most people do not need to. When you have spent years learning to receive communication that is not encoded in words, you become extraordinarily sensitive to the information that is always present in how a person holds themselves, how they position themselves relative to the people around them, what they do with their hands when they are not performing anything for anyone, where they look when they think nobody is watching. This information is available in every room, from every person, at all times. Most people do not receive it because they are focused on the verbal channel and treat the nonverbal as supplementary. I learned, through Marcus, to treat them as equally weighted, which means I receive approximately twice the information from any interaction that most people receive. It is not a superpower. It is a skill, and like all skills, it was built through necessity and practice, and the particular motivation of loving someone enough to learn what they needed. I want to tell you something about the 42nd floor that the people who work on it do not know I know, because it is relevant to what happened, and because it illustrates what I mean about invisibility as access. The 42nd floor of Aldren Capital Management is a floor that performs confidence. Everything on it is designed to communicate certainty, from the materials of the furniture to the height of the ceilings, to the way the light falls on the glass conference rooms during the hours when clients are present. The performance of confidence is the core product of a private equity firm, and the 42nd floor is its primary stage. What I have observed from that stage over 17 years is that the performance is most complete when the most is at stake, and that the gap between the performance and what is actually happening behind it is widest in the moments that matter most. I have cleaned that floor during negotiations that were going wrong. I have been present for the kind of conversations that happen after a large deal collapses. I have watched the architecture of confidence do the thing that architecture of confidence always eventually does, which is to reveal, in the wrong moment, what is underneath it. I do not say this critically. I say it because it is true of all of us, in all the buildings we occupy. We perform what the building requires, and we carry what the performance does not have room for, and the carrying shows in the face and the shoulders and the hands when we believe the room is empty of anyone who will notice. The room has never been empty of me. The boy's name is Noah. He is 6 years old. He is the son of Catherine Aldren, who is 43 years old and the chief executive of Aldren Capital Management, which her grandfather founded, and which she has run for 11 years with a precision and intensity that the financial press finds admirable, and the staff of the 42nd floor find consistently challenging. She is not a cruel woman. I want to be clear about this because it is relevant to everything that follows. She is a woman who has decided, at some point in the years of building and running a firm of this scale, that the most reliable tool she has is her own judgment applied with consistency and without sentiment. This applies to personnel decisions the same way it applies to investment decisions, and it is the reason that, when I was reported by a senior vice president in October for an incident I will describe shortly, her initial response was to order my termination without asking me for my account of what had happened. It was also the reason that, when she watched what happened afterward, she did something that I suspect is not in her standard operating procedure, which is to change her mind in front of her staff and not explain the change. I should explain the incident. But before I do, I want to describe the fire drill itself, because the fire drill is not incidental to what happened, and is in fact the first cause in the chain. Fire drills in corporate towers are announced in advance to most departments so that people can plan around them, close documents, save work, not be in the middle of sensitive calls when the alarm sounds. They are not always announced to the facilities team, because the facilities team is assumed to be drill-ready at all times as part of the building's emergency protocols. They are also not announced to whichever executive's child happens to be visiting the office that day, because the child's presence on the floor is not in anyone's planning system. This particular drill was announced at 11:14. The alarm sounded at 11:15. I was in the service corridor replacing a light fixture when it went off. I have been through dozens of fire drills in this building, and my response is automatic, which is to stop what I am doing, account for anyone in my section, and proceed to the stairwell as protocols require. The protocols do not account for the fact that a 6-year-old child with sensory sensitivities might be in a glass-walled office on the executive floor when a 95 decibel alarm activates without warning. The protocols do not account for a lot of things. That is why there are people whose job is to be present and paying attention when the protocols fall short. Noah came to the office with Catherine on a Thursday in October because his school was closed and his regular caregiver had a family emergency, and there was no other arrangement available on short notice. He was brought to the executive floor at 9 in the morning and established in Catherine's office with a tablet and a set of headphones and the understanding, communicated through the caregiver system Catherine used, that he would be fine as long as the environment remained consistent and nobody disrupted the routine he had established on the tablet. He had been to the office twice before under similar circumstances, and both times this arrangement had worked. On this particular Thursday, it worked until 11:15, when a fire drill was announced without prior notice to Catherine's office, and the alarm sounded, and Noah's headphones did not fully dampen it, and the consistency of the environment collapsed in the way that consistency collapses for a 6-year-old with autism when an unexpected sensory event overrides every coping mechanism simultaneously. He left Catherine's office, not in distress exactly, in the specific movement pattern that I recognized from 17 years of watching Marcus navigate unexpected sensory disruptions, which is purposeful rather than panicked, moving away from the source of the disruption towards something that registers as safer. He came down the corridor past the executive suites and turned left toward the service corridor, which is quieter than the main floor because the acoustic properties of the service corridor are different, the walls absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. And he went into the service corridor, and he sat down on the floor against the wall next to my supply cart, and he pulled his knees to his chest, and he waited for the world to become manageable again. I found him there because I was in the service corridor when he arrived. I sat down on the floor beside him, not close, not crowding, just near in the specific spatial arrangement that Marcus taught me, close enough to register as present and safe but far enough to not constitute an input he had to process. I did not speak. I waited. He waited. The alarm ran its cycle and stopped. The building returned to its ordinary acoustic state. After a few minutes, Noah uncurled slightly. He looked at my supply cart. He looked at the mop handle. He reached out and touched the mop handle. He looked at me. I said, "That is the mop." He said, "Mop." I said, "Yes." He touched it again. I said, "It is for cleaning the floors." He considered this. He said, "I like the floors." I said, "Me too. They are good floors." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He stayed in the service corridor for 22 minutes. When he was ready to leave, he stood up and he reached over and took my hand and held it for the walk back to the main corridor, which is a significant gesture from a child who does not extend physical contact easily or often. I walked him back to Catherine's office. A senior vice president saw me walking with Noah in the executive corridor, holding the child's hand, and reported the incident to Catherine as inappropriate physical contact between a custodial employee and the CEO's son. Catherine ordered my termination that afternoon. She was in a meeting when the report reached her, and she responded with the efficiency she applies to everything, which in this case meant authorizing my dismissal through the facility's manager without speaking to me directly, without asking for my account, and without any apparent consideration that the account of what had happened might be different from the account she had received. I was informed of the termination by the facility's manager at 3:15. He was apologetic in the way of a man who is delivering a decision he finds unjust but has no authority to dispute. I gathered my personal items. I was escorted to the elevator. Noah was in Catherine's office. He had apparently been told I was leaving. As I passed the glass wall of the executive suite, I saw him stand up from the floor where he had been sitting with the tablet. He walked to the office door. He opened it. He walked into the corridor. He walked to where I was standing at the elevator. He took my hand again. He did not say anything. He just held my hand and stood there, which is the clearest and most complete form of communication available to him, and which any person fluent in his language would have understood immediately. Catherine came out of her office. She saw her son holding the hand of the man she had just fired. She stood in the corridor and she looked at her son's face and she looked at mine, and she did not say anything for a long moment. I want to tell you about Noah's face in the elevator corridor because I think it is the most important image in this story and I want to describe it accurately. He was standing in the corridor holding my hand and he was looking at his mother, and what his face was doing was not what most people would expect from a 6-year-old in that situation. It was not pleading. It was not distressed. It was clear. It had the particular clarity of a child who has made a decision and is communicating it in the most direct way available to him, which in Noah's case is not words but positioning, which is to say the deliberate choice of where to stand and who to stand next to and what to hold. He had chosen me. He had chosen to stand next to me and hold my hand in the corridor of the company his mother ran, in front of the staff who had reported me and the facilities manager who had just handed me my termination, and he was holding my hand with the specific grip of a child who knows exactly what he is communicating and intends every bit of it. I have felt that grip before. It is the grip Marcus uses when he has decided something is safe and wants the world to know he has decided. It is not a soft grip. It is deliberate and complete. Catherine read it the way a mother reads the thing her child's body says more clearly than his words, which is to say she understood it immediately and completely. And the understanding changed something in her face that I had not seen change in 17 years of watching her face from corridors. I want to tell you what happened in that corridor because I think the details of it matter and I want to get them right. Noah held my hand. Catherine looked at her son, not at me, at Noah. She was reading him the way she had presumably been trying to read him for 6 years, and she was reading something she understood because a mother always understands when her child has found safety somewhere, even if she did not know the somewhere existed. She said, very quietly, to me and not to Noah what happened in the service corridor. I told her, not defensively, just what happened in the order it happened. The alarm, Noah in the corridor, the supply cart, the mop, the floors, the 22 minutes, the hand on the way back. She listened the way she listens in meetings, which I know from 17 years of peripheral observation, which is with complete attention and no expression that tells you what she is concluding. When I was done, she was quiet. Noah was still holding my hand. She looked at her son and she said, Noah. He looked at her. She said, do you want Mr. Pruitt to stay? He looked at me. He looked at her. He said, yes. She nodded. She looked at the facilities manager who was still standing at the elevator with my box of personal items. She said, please cancel the termination. The facilities manager said yes. She looked at me. She said, I owe you an apology. I said, you did not have the full information. She said I should have asked for it before I acted. I said yes. She looked at me for a moment. She said, my son does not extend contact to people he does not trust. I said, I know. I have a son like him. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, will you tell me about him? We talked for 40 minutes in the corridor outside her office, while Noah sat on the floor between us arranging pencils in a row by length, which is a thing he does when he is content. And I want to tell you about those 40 minutes in some detail because I think they are the most important 40 minutes in the story. Not the service corridor, not the elevator. The 40 minutes in the corridor with the pencils, because what happened in those 40 minutes was not the CEO being briefed by the custodian. It was two parents of children who communicate differently than the world understands, finding each other across the gap that is supposed to separate a CEO from a custodian, and discovering that the gap does not exist at the level of the thing they were actually talking about. The thing they were actually talking about was the specific love of a child who needs you to learn an entirely new way of being present, and that love has no hierarchy. It is exactly as difficult and exactly as worth it regardless of what floor of the building you occupy. Catherine asked questions that told me she had been trying to understand for years and had not found the right person to ask. I answered with everything Marcus had given me, which is to say with everything I had. Noah arranged his pencils and listened to us talk about him and his cousin, which is what the children of their parents always are when their parents are finally telling the truth to someone who can receive it. While Noah sat on the floor between us arranging pencils in a row by length, which is a thing he does when he is content. I told her about Marcus, about the 3 years before the diagnosis, and the 5 years after it before I understood his language well enough to stop misreading him more often than not. About the specific education of learning to receive non-verbal communication as primary rather than supplementary. About what invisibility teaches you if you are paying attention, and about the 17 years of being the least noticed person on the 42nd floor, and what those years had given me in terms of understanding what is actually happening in any room at any moment. She listened the whole time. Noah listened too, in the way he listens, which is without appearing to listen but missing nothing. When I was done, she said, I have been trying to reach him for 6 years. I said, you are reaching him. Every time you read his face instead of his words, you are reaching him. She looked at her son. She said, "How do I learn to do it better?" I said, "You sit with him, not to fix anything, not to get him to produce something for you. Just to be in the same space doing the same kind of quiet work, and you let him see that you are not going anywhere and that his silence is not a problem you are trying to solve." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That sounds simple." I said, "It is the hardest thing there is." She said, "Show me." I sat down on the floor. She looked at me for a moment and then she sat down on the floor across from Noah. Noah looked at his pencils. He picked up the longest one and held it out toward his mother. She took it. She held it. She did not say anything. He picked up the next one and held it out. She took that one too. They sat on the floor in the executive corridor of Aldren Capital Management, arranging pencils together in a row by length, the CEO and her son. And I watched from the wall behind her, and I thought about Marcus, about the kitchen table and the object arrangements, and the 6 years it took me to understand that the arrangements were sentences, and the sentences were complete, about how long the language takes to learn, and how worth it the learning is, about the 17 years I had spent being invisible on this floor, carrying everything Marcus had taught me into rooms where nobody knew I had it, and about how the carrying had finally, on a Thursday in October, found the room it was supposed to find. I want to tell you what changed on the 42nd floor after that Thursday, because what changed is not what you might expect. Nothing changed dramatically. There was no announcement, no grand gesture, no visible restructuring of how things worked. What changed was smaller and more permanent. Catherine began stopping at the service corridor when she passed it on her way to meetings, not to speak to me necessarily, just to look in the way you look at a place that has become meaningful when it was not before. She began arriving at the office slightly earlier on the mornings Noah came with her, which gave him time to settle into the space before the day's pace required him to navigate it. She began keeping a box of objects in her desk drawer, specific objects that Noah had shown interest in, which is the kind of preparation that requires knowing your child well enough to predict what they will need, which is the kind of knowing that is built through exactly the work I had described to her in the corridor. These are small things. They are also everything. They are the difference between managing a child and receiving one. I noticed them from the corridors the way I notice everything on the 42nd floor, which is completely, and without being noticed noticing. She called me into her office the following week. She sat across from me in her executive chair, and I sat in the chair across from her, and neither of us had our usual professional context, which is to say she was not the CEO, and I was not the custodian. We were two parents of children who communicated differently than most people understood, and we talked about it for an hour. She told me things about the 6 years of raising Noah that she had not told anyone else, not because I asked, but because the particular solitude of raising a child the world does not know how to receive is the kind of solitude that, when it finally meets someone who recognizes it, releases what has been held. I told her things about Marcus that I rarely say out loud because the speaking of them requires the listener to understand what they mean, and most listeners do not have the context. She had the context. We talked until her 2 o'clock meeting appeared at the door, and she said we should continue this. We did, the following week and the week after that. Noah came to the office 3 more times that autumn, and each time he found the service corridor and the supply cart and the mop, and we sat together for however long he needed. He started calling me Len, which is what Marcus calls me, which is the name my son uses when he wants to distinguish me from the category of adult and put me in the category of known safe person. The first time Noah said Len, I had to step into the service corridor for a moment before I came back. Some things arrive without warning and need a moment to be received. She offered me more money, significantly more. I told her no. She said she felt she owed me something larger than a salary. I told her what I always tell people who arrive at this point in a conversation like this, which is that the something larger was not mine to take payment for. The something larger was Marcus's. He had built it in me over 20 years of kitchen tables and object arrangements, and the 6 years it took me to stop misreading him more often than I got it right. I had just been carrying it. It had found Noah because I was in the right corridor at the right time, and I had the right 17 years of invisibility behind me and the specific education of a father who had learned to receive his son. You cannot pay for that. The paying would change what it was. I told her what she could do instead. I told her there were parents all over this city who were sitting with children like Marcus and like Noah with nobody to tell them that the language their children were speaking was real and complete and learnable and worth the learning. If she wanted to do something, she could fund something for them. A program, a support network, a resource that reached the parents who were in the years I had been in before I found my footing. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Will you help design it?" I said yes. I still clean the floors on 38 through 42. I still push the cart and restock the coffee machine and move through the spaces where information, lives, and people have decided I am not a recipient of it. But 2 evenings a month I sit in a room with a group of parents who are in the early years of learning their children's language, and I tell them what I know, which is everything Marcus gave me over 20 years of loving him precisely as he is. The floors are good floors. They are worth keeping clean. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. Is there someone in your life whose language you have not yet learned? Not because you do not want to, because the learning is hard and slow and requires you to be wrong many times before you are right, and the being wrong is embarrassing, and the pace of the learning feels unbearably slow against the urgency of wanting to reach them. I want to tell you that the pace is the learning, that the years you spend getting it wrong are not wasted years. They are the years that make you into the person who eventually gets it right, and getting it right when it finally comes is worth every year of the getting there. Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the person whose language you are learning. Tell me what you have understood so far. I read every single one, and I would be honored to know. Hit subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like so this reaches the parent who needs it tonight, and I will see you in the next one.